Cloud. We are now recording, and I need to make you co-host, and I do that
Yes.
in participants, right?
You can do it on my box also. You can just click the little blue box at the top, and one of the options should be to make. And for everyone else, if you're not muted, please go ahead and mute yourself. Sorry. There we go. Okay, thank you, Karen. So, welcome everyone. It's great to see all of you. We have a big crowd again, like last week. It's really a pleasure to see all your faces. And for those whose faces I can't see, it's great to have you here with us. I can see your names or your photos, or you may just be standing very still. I'm not sure, one or the other. But at any rate, it's great to gather as a congregation for learning and to really dig into some of the meatier stuff of Judaism here. So first, before we start, a couple of thank yous, which I mentioned 2 weeks ago as well, but I just wanted to thank the members of the Adult Education Committee and the members of the Great Jewish Thinkers Subcommittee for their work in putting together this program. I also wanted to thank, first of all, our anonymous angel who sponsored this program, this entire module of four sessions, and then as well to everyone who donated toward this program. When you were registering, that all goes into our adult education fund to make this kind of programming possible in the shul. So glad you're all, we appreciate that support and glad you're all here. As well, without making a lot of announcements, I'll just mention that our next one of these sessions will be 2 weeks from tonight, and the following will be 2 weeks after that. The next time we do this, I'm going to try to schedule them not all 2 weeks apart, but for this time, they are. And while I've got all of you, we also have Rock and Roll Shabbat coming up this Friday night. That's going to be a lot of fun. Our usual Shabbat stuff, Torah study on Saturday morning, services, which is all on Zoom, and then Saturday night Havdalah. As well, for anybody who's not part of Kol Ami, and I see there's some non-members with us here tonight, welcome. We're glad you're here with us, and we welcome you for any programming, learning, classes, services, all of the above. Please do join us here at Kol Ami. It's a wonderful community, and in particular, I'll just put a plug in. On Thursday mornings at 9 o'clock, we gather for Talmud study. So only 12 hours after we say goodnight tonight, we'll gather again for Talmud study, and we're having a really good time making our way through Tractate Brachot, the tractate having to do with blessings in the Talmud, very, very slowly. About a year and 2 months in, we've read 10 pages of the Talmud, so you can tell what great discussions we're having. So if you haven't been with us, it's not too late. You can join us for the discussion tomorrow morning. It's actually this same Zoom link. With all that, I will leave it. Karen, if you don't mind just to put that link in the chat one more time, because I think those who showed up afterwards probably didn't see it. Karen's going to put the link to the materials for this evening in the chat. There they are. You may have received them by email, and I'm also going to share my screen, but in case you want to have them in front of you, they will be there as well. So I'm going to share my screen now, and you should see in front of you, here we go, the blessing for study. You may want to put your Zoom into side-by-side mode, which you can do in the view options at either the top or the bottom of the screen. That will allow you to see the shared screen on one side and the people on the other side. So let's join together in the blessing for study that's right here in front of you. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to study words of Torah. So we're here for our second week of studying Maimonides, also known as the Rambam. I'll very, very briefly go back over some of what we talked about last week, just by way of review, and then we're going to launch into something different. Tonight, this is probably the most, shall we say, esoteric of the topics that we're going to look at, but Maimonides is nothing if not esoteric, so you've come to the right place. But our session is really our program is really divided into three sections. Last week we talked largely about how Maimonides reads the Torah, and as we were reading, we understood that Maimonides reads the Torah according to a particular understanding of God. We'll talk about that in a moment. This week's session is going to be devoted to learning more about what does Maimonides believe and understand about God, and to compare it a little bit to our own belief structures around what God is, what God isn't, what we can know and say about God. Next week, or 2 weeks from now, our session will be devoted to what Maimonides says about our religious actions. So, given what Maimonides believes about God, what then is the meaning of prayer, the meaning of performing mitzvot, the meaning of God's relationship with us? But in order to understand that, we have to first understand what he has to say about God. So Maimonides, as you see before you, his name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and I'm highlighting it there in front of you. So his name was Moshe. His name wasn't Maimonides. And Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, or the son of Maimon, is known most often in English and in Greek or Latin as Maimonides. This little IDES at the end, that means son of. So Maimonides is the son of Maimon, which of course is what his name is. He's also known in rabbinic circles as the Rambam. I've highlighted it there. Rambam is an acronym for Rabbi Moshe ben, or son of, Maimon. So I'll use those names interchangeably to talk about this great thinker and philosopher. The Rambam was as I said, he was a philosopher, and he's writing, as we learned last week, in the tradition of the Greek philosophers, and most specifically Aristotle. But he was also a rabbi. He was a halachist. He was a Jewish legal thinker. He was a Jewish philosopher, so he's really writing about Judaism. He also, among other things, was a doctor, and as well as a lawyer. I think I made the joke last week that Maimonides is everything that you want to bring home to your Jewish mother, right? He was a doctor and a lawyer, and a rabbi, by the way. I don't know if that's what you want to bring home to your Jewish mother or not, but doctor and lawyer certainly. He's really one of the great Jewish thinkers of all Jewish, of history. And Maimonides in many ways sets the stage for the way that Jews will think about God and about Jewish practice and about Jewish law for the next almost 1,000 years. And here we are living nearly 900 years after his life, still very much influenced by the work and the thinking that Maimonides did. So we learned last week that Maimonides reads the Torah as essentially one long allegory. When he reads the Torah, he, as a rationalist, he has a problem. And Maimonides' problem is that the Torah speaks about God in ways that he doesn't believe that God is. And by the way, ways that many of us don't believe that God is either. For example, the Torah says that God has a face. The Torah says that God has a back. The Torah says that God has emotions, that God gets angry, that God is jealous, that God has these what we might call anthropomorphic qualities that don't sound anything like the God that he is describing or that he believes in, or truly that most of us believe in. When we think about people being created in the image of God, we don't believe that means that God literally has an image. We don't believe that means that God looks like something. Well, neither did Maimonides. And so when he read the Torah, he had to read it as an allegory, because he believed that the Torah couldn't possibly be saying those things that it seemed to be saying. This points up an important difference between the way that we as liberal Jews read Torah and the way that Maimonides and other pre-modern Jews read the Torah. When we read the Torah, we read it as the product of a given time and place. So if the Torah has what sound to us like anthropomorphic terms in it, or what sound to us like maybe pre-monotheistic or proto-monotheistic terminology in it, we can look at it and say, well, that was what those people in that time and place believed. Or that the Torah is written, it represents a number of different voices, and the voices within it don't necessarily have to agree with each other. Those who lived before the Enlightenment and before the application of scientific method to the Torah believe largely that the Torah speaks with one voice and that the Torah represents a divine voice. And third, a really important point, that the Torah speaks not in the language of a given time and place when it was written, but in timeless language. That is to say, whatever the Torah says is meant to apply in every generation. So that Maimonides can't possibly fathom the idea that the writer of the Torah believes that, God walks with Adam, or that God shows Moses God's back, because Maimonides doesn't believe those things. And so therefore, as he reads the Torah, he has to read it as allegory, as meaning different things. So for example, last week we read that when the Torah says that people are created in the image and likeness of God, that the image here can't be a physical image. It must instead refer to an essence. And he jumps through a lot of etymological hoops in order to prove that the Hebrew word tselem, which means image, doesn't necessarily, or maybe doesn't even at all, mean a physical image, that it means the essence of what something is. He jumps through similar hoops, and I'm denigrating it a little bit by calling it jumping through hoops. It's not hoops as much as he brings examples from elsewhere in the Bible in order to prove, for example, that the word panim, or face, doesn't mean God has a face, but rather that it means the presence or existence of a thing. So that when God says, you cannot see my face, it doesn't mean that God has a face. Rather, it means that Moses can't know the true essence, or the true essence of what God is. But that when God says, you can see my back, it doesn't mean God has a back like Zeus might have had a back, or Athena or Apollo might have had a back. Rather, it means that we can experience God through the things that come behind God, or the things that come about as a result of God's existence. So Maimonides reads the entire Torah in this way, as an allegory that is meant to agree with his neo-Aristotelian rationalist philosophy of what God is. Now that we understand that, we can jump into what he actually believes about God. And what are the things that Maimonides says that we can say about God. So before we do that, I'm going to end my share for a moment, and I want to invite you, I think because there are a lot of us, it makes the most sense to do this through the chat. I want to invite you to describe God. What are the words that you might use to describe what God is? You can put them into the chat.
Hi. Did you have to write it in?
Yes, please. If you can put it into the chat, that way we can all see.
How do I do that?
There's a chat button. If you're on a phone or an iPad, you won't be able to do that. So in that case, that's okay. So, all right, I'm seeing words here. I'm going to read through some of these. And yes, Peter and Joy, I see your text. And yes, I'll try to make the text larger if I can. So, God is nature, creator, unknowable. Somebody put the Big Bang, mystery, being, inspiring. Somebody said the still small voice within us, a natural presence, omnipotent, which means all powerful, ever present. God is always present. God is a belief. God is essence. God is a perception of human beings. So we have a lot of different words to describe God here. Somebody said an imagination, which I see, Anita, you need Herman Cohen. We'll get to him in the fall. He says God is an idea, not a being. Don't worry, we'll get there eventually. He's my favorite. For this exercise, God is also ineffable, Alex says, and somebody says a spirit. So we have a lot of words that we use to describe God. Other words that I sometimes hear people using to describe God, at least in the Jewish tradition, I hear God described as wise. I hear God described as moral. In fact, I would just put in here a guide or a moral compass. God described as powerful, which is another way of saying omnipotent that somebody put in here. God described as good in some contexts. So there are a lot of words that we use to describe God. One word that I noticed that nobody said here, but that certainly is an important word for describing God in Judaism, is the word one. That we declare every single day when we say the Shema, for those who say the Shema every day or every week or whenever you say the Shema, we declare Adonai Echad. One of the central beliefs about God is that God is one. There is only one God in the universe, so to speak. And so Maimonides is going to challenge our assumption or our belief that God can be described in these words. And he's going to challenge our understanding of the meanings of some of these words. Let me share my screen again. And yes, I can definitely make it bigger. Hopefully that's better for everybody. So for those who have the text in front of you, I'm on page 9 here. And we're going to begin by reading a little bit here about what it means to say that God is one. So I'm just going to call on somebody to read. If you don't want to read, just tell me no. Sorry, somebody is unmuted. If you can just mute yourself, make sure everyone is muted here. If you don't want to read, that's fine. Just go ahead and tell me no, I'd rather not, and we'll call on somebody else. So, let's see. Angel, would you mind reading a bit for us here, right here at Guide 151?
It is a self-evident truth that the attribute is not inherent in the object to which it is ascribed, but it is superadded to its essence and is consequently an accident. If the attribute denoted the essence to
Don't worry about
it. Oh, okay. Of the object, it would be neither mere tautology, as if, example, one would say man is man, or the explanation of a name, man is a speaking animal. For the words speaking animal include the true essence of man, and there is no third element besides life and speech in the definition of man. When he, therefore, is described by the attributes of life and speech, these are nothing but explanation of the name man. That is to say, that the thing which is called man consists of life and speech.
I'm going to stop you there. I promised you esoteric. I have delivered, right, so far. So what is Maimonides doing here? He is explaining to us what it means to describe something. He says an attribute of a thing. Well, there are essentially two kinds of attributes. There is an attribute that is the essence of a thing, and there is an attribute that is not the essence of a thing, that he is what he calls superadded to the thing. So the essence of humanity, what is the essence of human being? What is the definition of human being? We can agree or disagree with his definition, but he defines human being as a speaking animal. By speaking, what Maimonides actually means here is an animal with intellectual capacity. That is to say, he's associating intellect with the power of speech. Of course, it's not always true that people who, that all human beings can speak. There are various reasons that, that might not be the case. But at any rate, what he really means is something that is both alive and has intellectual capacity. That, as far as he is concerned, is the definition or the essence of human being. Any other description, any other attribute is what he would call superadded on top of that thing. So we might say you have gray hair. We might say you are tall, short, light-skinned, dark-skinned, kind, old, young. There's 1,000 words we could say. Those are not part of the essence of the human being. Rather, they are superadded. They are what he calls an accident. And by an accident, he doesn't mean it's accidental so much as that it's extra to the essence of the thing. One of these things, one human might have blonde hair, another might have brown hair. One might be old and one might be young. One might be skinny and one might be heavy. But those things are not a part of the essence of the thing. All right, so far so good. Where were we? Angela, if you don't mind to go on here at this word it.
It will now be clear that the attribute must be one of two things, either the essence of the object described. In that case, it is a mere explanation of a name, and on that account we might admit the attribute in reference to God. But we reject it from another cause, as will be shown, or the attribute is something different from the object described, some extraneous superadded element. In that case, the attribute would be an accident, and he who merely rejects the appellation accidents in reference to the attributes of God does not thereby alter their character. For everything superadded to the essence of an object joins it without forming part of its essential properties, and that constitutes an accident.
All right, I'm going to stop you again. So this is essentially what we already talked about. But what's important here is that you need to understand that the what we might think of as an adjective, when I describe somebody as tall, what Maimonides is saying is actually that that's not an adjective is not simply a descriptor of the person. An adjective is a state of being. It is the participation of that thing in this other thing. So I am not tall. We'll say short. At 5'6", I think I qualify there. So as a person who is short or who is tall, what I am is a human being who is participating in a thing that we might call tallness or gray-hairedness or kindness or whatever. So I am several different things, right? I am a person, that is to say a speaking animal as far as Maimonides is concerned. I also might be a person who is 5'6", or I am a person who has a beard, or I am a person who is this or who is that. That is a thing that I am participating in, essentially, and that is what we mean when we describe when we describe a person. That person is or an object. That object is participating in this other thing that exists in the world. For those who have read Plato, this is reminiscent of Plato's forms. Plato believes that there is a perfect form of everything that exists in our world that exists in a higher spiritual plane. So if there's a rock on this world, then that's because there is a form of rock in another world. And this rock is participating in the rockness, so to speak, of the rock, of what exists in a higher spiritual plane. So Maimonides is buying into that idea to say that we can only describe people by describing what other things they participate in. Now let's go on. Angela, do you mind one more? Add to this.
Add to this the logical consequence of admitting many attributes, the existence of many eternal beings. There cannot be any belief in the unity of God except by admitting that he is one simple substance without any composition or plurality of elements, one from whatever side you view it and by whatever test you examine it, not divisible into two parts in any way and by any cause, nor capable of any form of plurality, either objectively or subjectively, as will be provided in this treatise.
Okay, so now we're getting to God, and this is really where this is all headed here. What has Maimonides said here about God? Anybody want to take a stab at explaining what we just read Maimonides to be explaining? It's okay if not. If you want, you can raise your hand electronically if you'd like to be our philosopher and explain this to us. All right, fine, I'll do it. So Maimonides has essentially said, remember that to describe a person or a thing as something means describe that person as existing in or as participating in another thing, as being a part of another thing. But there's a problem. What is it that Judaism says over and above everything else about God? Judaism says that God is one. And if God is one, I saw somebody's, other people's fingers going like this. If God is one, that means that God cannot be any other thing. God cannot be one, be the unique be the unique single God in the universe. If God is also participating in other things, that would mean God is not one, because God is also that thing or that thing or that thing. What you are is you are made up of many parts and pieces and things, right? You are not one. You are many. But God is echad. God is one. Therefore, God cannot be any of those things. So we already have a problem here. We started off our day here by describing God in lots of different terms. Maimonides is already telling us there is a problem with trying to describe God. Maimonides is also telling us something important about monotheism. That is to say that God's oneness, which is so central to Judaism, is more than just a number. It's not to say there's only one God. We could say, if we only believed in, Apollo as the only God, we could say, well, Apollo is the only God. But if Apollo also has a face and a back and something that Apollo looks like and, and runs around and is there but not there, then that doesn't sound like the God of Judaism. So God's oneness is not merely a state of number. It's not that there's only one God. God's oneness is a state of separateness, of uniqueness and simplicity. That is to say that God can only be one thing, and also that nothing else can be that thing together with God. So if God is wise and wisdom is a thing, then God is one more thing, which God is more than one thing, which makes it problematic to say God is wise. And we're going to get later to how Maimonides solves this, but already we have a problem that it's hard to say God is wise, because that would already be going against what it means to believe that there's only one God. I see a couple of hands. I see Peter and Joy, and then I see Phil. Go ahead, Peter and Joy.
It's just one of us. If that's true, if what he's saying is true, then it denies all the, I hate to use the word again, but all the attributes, the loving God, the wise God, the simple God, the angry God. He's denying all of those attributes, and he's also denying the spirituality of God.
Why does that deny the spirituality of God, Peter?
Well, because it's an attribute, and he's saying there are no attributes. It is unity. It is a singular, and to use your words, it can't be a ness of anything.
Mm-hmm.
So there can't be any spirituality ness.
So to imply, all right, so spirituality in the sense of being a spirit, yes, right? The word spirit, as we use it, Maimonides is going to later teach that words like that can't describe God. In fact, spoiler alert, at the end of the day, we're essentially going to say something like that God can't be described in positive terms, but we'll get there. But spirituality in terms of how we relate to God, that's the next question, right? After we establish that God is what God is, then we have to ask ourselves the question of what does it mean for us to relate to a God that is as Maimonides describes. So that's great, and let's put a pin in that for right now. I see Phil, Alex, Sandy. If you can, let's try to keep the questions relatively short because we do have a lot of material to get through, but let's definitely hear them. Go ahead, Phil.
Sort of along the same lines as what Peter said, though, doesn't this contradict the idea of the 13 attributes of God that's part of Judaism? El Rahum, the Hanun, and all that stuff.
Yeah, so one of the things that Maimonides is going to ask, and we'll get there by the end. He does believe that the Torah describes God, but he also believes that no words can truly describe God at all. And ultimately, the teaching here is going to be that the words that we use to describe God don't mean the same thing when they refer to God as they do when they refer to us. Which is why, again, spoiler alert, the best way to describe God is by saying what God is not. But we'll get there. Sandy, and then Alex.
Thanks. So when I see the line, one from whatever side you view it, it actually reminds me of the blind men and the elephant, that depending on what they were holding, they each had a very, very different view. So it sounds like Maimonides is saying it's not up to interpretation, although I suspect that further on Maimonides will interpret it.
Well, he's
That's the image that came to mind.
yeah, I like that image, and the image of the the what did you say? It's the mice holding or touching the elephant, right?
No, there's a thing, it might be a parable, I'm not sure. Somebody else will know, but that, one man was holding the trunk and one person was holding the back leg and one was holding the ear. And so they all described something different, not recognizing that they were all connected and touching an elephant,
Right. It's
right?
actually
Because they were so zeroed in on their own viewpoint.
it's a great image, actually. Maimonides uses a slightly different image, which is that of a fire, which we will again get to today, depending on how much text we get to. He says that if you were to describe a fire, you might think there was one element within the fire that heats things, and another that hardens things, and another that burns things. But we know that it is the same thing that's doing all of those different things. And so we may experience God in different ways, but that doesn't mean that God is divided or is a bunch of different things. And as far as he's concerned, that's what it means to say that God is one. Not only that there's only one God numerically, but also that God is one throughout. There is a oneness that is synonymous with God. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, what I was thinking is that the problem here is that we are three-dimensional beings for whom time always flows forward, that need to describe the world in terms of nouns and adjectives, right? And common verbs like has or does or can, right? Or can do. And the problem is that all those constraints are terrible when you're trying to describe something that escapes that universe, that three-dimensional, forward-flowing timeline world can be described in this type of ways. Right? That is what Maimonides is struggling with, that the object that he's trying to describe is way above the descriptor and the language for description.
Mm-hmm. Right. How do you describe something that is outside of the capacity of our language to describe, because it's largely outside of our experience? Maimonides believes, for various reasons, that God exists and that there is within the universe that if there is a universe, essentially he believes that if there is a creation, there must be a creator in some way, whether that's a first cause type creator, or whatever, but that creator, that God, is outside of our experience. And how do you in the end use human words to describe something that are outside the capacity of human words to describe? So I want to skip forward a little bit, but this next part is important. He's going to go into different ways to describe things. We won't read all of this, but one way to describe is through its definition. Remember, we said that human being he describes as something that is alive and has reason. He described it before as a speaking animal, but really he means something that is alive and has intellect. Or you can describe, and he said we can't describe God that way because we don't know God's existence. Or as it says here, there are no previous causes to God's existence, which is to say we can't put God into categories because there are no causes or categories to which God is subject. Or you can describe God as part of its definition, but for the same reasons you can't describe God that way. Or we can describe God, thirdly, by a quality, or we can describe a thing or a person by a quality. We might describe you by intellectual or moral qualities. We might describe something by a physical quality. It is soft or hard or large or small or purple or green. We might describe a person by their, what he calls passive qualities or emotions. That is to say, a person is passionate, irritable, timid, merciful, etc. Or we might describe a thing by its what he calls quantity, which has to do with its shape, long, short, curved, straight, etc. Consider all of these. I'll read this paragraph. He says, consider all of these and similar attributes, and you will find that they cannot be employed. Did I want to read this? So well, essentially, none of these can be employed to describe God for reasons we've talked about already, because they imply that there are parts of God, that God is participating in curvedness or wiseness or bigness or smallness or goodness or whatever, and that according to the way that we've described God here, God can't be described in any of those ways. Okay, so we've put that to bed as far as he's concerned. Fourthly, though, here's another way to describe a thing, is in relation to another thing. Sometimes by my, children's teachers, I am described as Noam's dad, or my youngest son, Yair, actually has a friend who calls me Yair's dad. Hey, Yair's dad. How you doing, Yair's dad? Like, do you even know my name? Do I have a name? Or am I just Yair's dad? Well, we sometimes describe people or things in relation to other things. We might say, it's the third house on the right. That's a way of saying this is the house that's behind the other two houses on the right side. We're describing things in relation to other things. Can we describe God that way? Possibly. I want to ask someone, again, you can always tell me no, but Barry Steen, would you be willing to read a bit here where it says fourthly? No, Barry says no, no problem. All right, well, let's stick with the Barrys. Barry Freud, would you read for us?
Yes, okay. Fourthly, a thing is described by its relation to another thing, example, to time, to space, or to a different individual. Thus we say Zaid, the father of A, or the partner of B, or who dwells at a certain place, or who lived at a stated time. This kind of attribute does not necessarily imply plurality or change in the essence of the object described. For the same Zaid, to whom reference is made, is the partner of Amru, the father of Bir, the master of Khalid, the friend of Zaid, dwells in a certain house, and was born in a certain year. Such relations are not the essence of a thing, nor are they intimately connected with it as qualities.
I'm going to stop you for just a second, Barry, if you don't mind. So this is relatively simple, right? We can describe, each of us can be described by many different ways. I am the child of such and such, the brother of such and such, the parent of such and such, the business partner of such and such. I also live in this place and lived in this century. So these are all the ways that you might describe me in reference to other people, places, time periods, etc. None of those make me a different person, right? I'm all the same person, even though I'm all of those different things. So Maimonides is going to go on to say, maybe this is the way that we can describe God, but he's going to dispel that notion also. So Barry, if you'll go on, we are here where it says at. Barry, you're muted.
At first thought, it would seem that they may be employed in reference to God, but after careful and thorough consideration, we are convinced of their inadmissibility. It is quite clear that there is no relation between no relation between God and time or space, for time is an accident connected with motion, insofar as the latter includes the relation of anteriority and posteriority, and is expressed by number, as is explained in books devoted to this subject. And since motion is one of the conditions to which only material bodies are subject, and God is immaterial, there can be no relation between him and time. Similarly, there is no relation between God and space.
So we can't say the God who lives in the synagogue. This is, by the way, very different from early Judaism, where there was an understanding that God dwelt in the temple, or that God was somehow more in the temple than anywhere else, or that gods lived on top of mountains or anything like that. So, lest we should think that this is obvious, this has not been obvious to people throughout time. And one of the reasons that we believe this is because Maimonides believed it, following after Aristotle, and we have been recipients of this rationalist tradition. So we can't say God lives in the temple or in the ark. We can't say God lived in a given century. We've disproven that God can be referred to in relation to time or place. What about in relation to substances or people? Can God be referred to in relation to us? Can you say, God is the father of such and such, or the or the relation to someone else. I'll read a little bit here. But what we have to investigate and examine is this part that I'm highlighting. Whether some real relation exists between God and any of the substances created by God, by which God could be described. That there is no correlation between God and any of God's creatures can easily be seen. For the characteristic of two objects correlative to each other is the equality of their reciprocal relation. Now, as God has absolute existence, while all other beings have only possible existence, as we shall show, there consequently cannot be any correlation between God and God's creatures. So that bears a little bit of explanation. When it says possible existence versus absolute existence, what it essentially means is that you, as a human being, you exist in a certain time and place. You exist in a context in the world. But God's existence is something different from that. God's existence, as far as Maimonides is concerned, is proved by the existence of the universe and is therefore not contingent on anything else, on the universe, on anything that caused it. And if God's existence is totally different than our existence, then they actually can't be compared. There actually can't be a relation between the two. Consequently, I'm going to jump down a little bit to right here. Consequently, there is no relation whatever between God and any other being. For whenever we speak of a relation between two things, these belong to the same kind. But when two things belong to different kinds, though of the same class, there is no relation between them. We therefore do not say, this red compared to that green is more or less or equally intense. That is to say, we can't say, he describes it better later, actually, where he says, where is it? He essentially says something like, you can't compare between like sharp and sour. There's no comparison between those two things. You can't compare between tall and red. They're not of the same type. They're not of the same essence or the same kind of thing. That God and us are the same thing. Because we don't have the same kind of existence, we can't be described in similar terms. You can't actually describe God in the same kinds of terms that you can describe human beings in, which is, again, where we're going with this in terms of describing God. So that means that you can't actually say God is more wise than us. You can't actually say God is more powerful than a human being, or bigger than a planet, or less evil than a person. You can't say that because God does not exist on the scale of the things that we are. We simply exist in we simply have different kinds of existence, which makes it, again, quite difficult to describe what God is if none of your words have any meaning in describing what God is. So how can we describe God? Well, one way, which we learned last week, has to do with describing God through the things that exist as a result of God. Barry, you were reading. Would you mind reading one more paragraph for us, please? This one. And you're muted again, Barry.
Fifthly, a thing is described by its actions. I do not mean by its actions the inherent capacity for a certain work, as is expressed in carpenter, painter, or smith, for these belong to the class of qualities which have been mentioned above. But I mean the action the latter has performed. We speak, example, of Zaid, who made this door, built that wall, wove that garment. This kind of attributes is separate from the essences of the thing described, and therefore appropriate to be employed in describing the Creator, especially since we know that these different actions do not imply that different elements must be contained in the substance of the agent by which the different actions are produced, as will be explained. On the contrary, all the actions of God emanate from God's essence, not from any extraneous thing superadded to God's essence, as we have shown.
Thank you. So, in other words, how can we describe God? Maimonides says one way is that we can describe the things that exist because of God, because of what God is. This is similar to last week or to 2 weeks ago when we read that, when it says you cannot see my face, but you can see my back, that means that you can experience God not through God's essence, which is outside of the human capacity to experience, but rather by experiencing the thing that exists because God exists. And in fact, if I look through the chat of the things that you put into the chat earlier when you said when you describe God, some of you described God as nature or a natural presence. If you think about what are the things or the times or the experiences where we come into contact with God, many of us might describe experiences like experiencing God in nature or in a relationship or experiencing God in morality, in the relationship between two people, or in a helping kind of relationship between two people. Maimonides would say this is us describing God by describing the things that exist because God is. So this may be the closest we can come into describing God, or to coming into contact with God, by knowing that God's presence, so to speak, is felt in these things that exist because God exists. Phil, I see your hand. Go ahead.
To me, the problem with that is that goes right against the oneness of God, because if you're describing God based on these things, you could be talking about 5 different things that could have come from 5 different gods.
Say that again. You could have those.
Okay, you're saying you can describe God because of the things that exist because of God, and you name various things. Those things might, if you're naming 5 things, those might have been they might have come into existence because of 5 different gods.
Okay, sure.
That
right.
goes against the idea that there's one God that created all those 5 things.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Phil, because look at the very next paragraph. Here's where he uses his description of the fire. We won't read this whole thing, but we can read here. So in fact, he actually starts off this paragraph by saying that a lot of people believe that there could be multiple attributes or multiple gods because they see different things around them, and then they read the Bible, and they take the Bible literally to believe that God has different attributes or that there are multiple powers. But he says, if you think about the fire, and this is what I said before in reference to Sandy, that the fire, here it is, fire melts certain things, makes others hard, it boils and burns and bleaches and blackens. We might think, if we describe the fire as bleaching, blackening, burning, boiling, hardening, and melting, we should be correct. And yet, he who does not know the nature of fire would think that it included 6 different elements, one by which it blackened, etc., etc. So, but we know that it's only one element, and the element of heat is what's doing all those things. So Maimonides isn't exactly here to argue with polytheists, right? Because polytheists could believe that there are different elements that are creating all these different things here on earth. But he says we understand both by reading Torah, which he believes is the word of God, and also by reading philosophy, which he believes shows that God must by nature be simple and undivided. We understand that there is a single entity, God, that creates all of these different things, but that itself is not divided into different elements that do these things. Hopefully that makes sense. Peter, go ahead.
Isn't he assuming the conclusion before he gives any proof? In other words, he's assuming that there is a God who created, or who created the fire, and the fire does all these things, but God was there and is there, and therefore the fire and what it does is not really a proof of God. It's a circular argument.
Mm-hmm. Well, so he's going to go on in part 2 of the guide to quote unquote prove the existence of God. I chose not to read that part. It's actually extraordinarily complicated, and there are something like 38 different proofs that he has for the existence of God here. But the essence of one of them is essentially what we would call the argument by design, that if there is an art, there must be an artist. We can agree or disagree with that description, with with that argument. But Maimonides is taking it as an article of not only of faith, but as an article of philosophy, that there is a creative force in the universe that has brought the universe somehow into existence. The difference, though, between Maimonides' God and the God of some other, both Jewish and otherwise philosophers, is that Maimonides' God is not a great big person who is the most powerful, the most wise, the most. Maimonides' God is something that is completely separate from the universe as we know it. But he does believe that the existence of a universe necessitates the existence of God. That could be a question that we ask our professor who's going to meet with us at our fourth session as well. Is Maimonides putting the cart before the horse by arguing all these things about God when, you could potentially disprove the existence of God? But in order to understand his philosophy, we need to understand that he takes it as an article both of faith and of science and of philosophy, that the existence of the universe necessitates the existence of a creative force, essentially. But that creative force can't be described in traditional terms. And that creative force, as we've said, he's redefined the meaning of Adonai Echad, where we might have read Adonai Echad to mean there's only one God. He's read Adonai Echad to mean that God is something completely indivisible, because if it wasn't, then that would be idolatry. It would be idolatry to say that God is wise, because that would mean that God is participating in the attribute of wisdom, which is outside of God, which is a thing that God created. So why would God need to participate in something that is outside of God's essence? So that's the way he's describing God. Moving along here. Oh, I see a hand. Anita and Norm, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to ask about, I fully recognize that we're dealing with philosophy, so there's no burden of proof. It's only a burden of consistency,
Logic.
which is in the form of logic. So I think that has to be recognized. The whole thing can be nonsense as long as it's consistent. It could be viewed as very strong philosophy. This idea of a force that is outside of our reality, could that force not be imagined to be a physical force of the universe that created the universe a gazillion trillion years ago, which is a force that we have no understanding of?
I'm sorry, ask your question again.
Well,
Norm.
he's saying that, I think what I'm understanding is that this oneness that is called God is not anything that is within our reality, and therefore it should not be described by any of the attributes that a human being would use to describe anything, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yes, essentially.
Yeah, but what happened? And he says it's a one thing that, one of its attributes is it created the universe. But what happens if that creation of universe is not through a being that transcends time and acts through time, whatever its description is, which we can't imagine because we're human? But what happens if it's an odd physical force that gave rise to the universe and is done?
Mm-hmm. That is, in other words, that gave rise to the universe at one time and then no longer exists.
It's no longer active.
Like the Big Bang.
Of course, much has occurred since,
Right.
But it's not that.
Mm-hmm. That force, yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I can't speak for Maimonides here, right? One of the things that Maimonides,
understandably, that's modest of you. I appreciate it.
Well, Maimonides was modest, so I think it's important to he actually was relatively immodest. He had a great high opinion in himself. So, I think one of the things that he very clearly believes is that God's presence is ongoing in nature. In fact, I don't know if I can find this description in here, but it does say in our texts somewhere that that one of the roles that God plays, as far as he's concerned, and truly as far as as Judaism has been concerned throughout much of Jewish thought, is that God's relationship with humanity and with the world is on being. It's a relationship of maintenance, not only of creation but of maintenance. That God is present in the ongoing renewal of the cycles of creation, right? And so we might argue then that the very existence of, and so maybe this is an answer to your question, the very existence of laws of nature is evidence of an ongoing relation of a creative process of some kind. That is God's ongoing providence. And the question you're asking really is one about providence, about whether the universe as we know it, continues to have a relationship with God, or did God wind the thing up and let it go? That's the clockmaker theory, right? That's deism. Is what it's called. Maimonides argues that there is ongoing providence, there is ongoing relationship with God, but it's not necessarily a relationship in the form of God answering your prayers but not answering your prayers. God, choosing you to get sick and you to be fine. Choosing you to be tall and you to be short. It's rather that providence, and in fact, here's a spoiler alert for 2 weeks from now, that it won't surprise you to learn that providence, as far as Maimonides is concerned, is of an intellectual form. That one of the ways that we continue to have relationship with God is that when we engage in intellectual pursuits, we understand more and more about the truths of the universe, and that thereby we're able to put things into perspective. We're able to prioritize. We're able to understand that the ills of our lives are maybe less important than some other things that matter more. So that our providence, as far as he's concerned, is actually through our intellectual connection to God, to our understanding of what really matters in the world. Now that maybe that's a human invention, right? We could argue as postmodernists that, all values are relative and those are all human inventions. Maimonides believes that we are actually accessing a greater intellect, that as intellectual beings ourselves, remember we are created in the image of God, and the image of God means to have an intellectual capacity that is like God's. As much as anything can be like God's in a world where we can't describe God in any words. And so that we are actually accessing something greater, some kind of greater intellectual and moral and values-based capacity, which continues to give our lives meaning. That might be how he would answer the question that you're asking. But again, I don't want to speak for him. There was another hand up. Was it Alex?
It was, but I think that you covered what I wanted to say.
Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So, how do you achieve this? Does he believe you achieve it by reading Torah, studying Torah, and that the Hasidim, the religious ones who sit all day and study, are they getting closer to God?
So that's a great question. And so the answer is yes, but no. He believes that you achieve this through study and learning, but not only of study of Torah, but through philosophical pursuit. So Maimonides believes that learning is the most important thing that a Jew or that a human being can do. In fact, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, we read what he called, here, I'll see if I can go back to it. This was way back at the beginning, page 3. What he calls the parable of the palace. And the parable of the palace is Maimonides' description of what he calls the king in the inner circle, in the inner chamber of the palace, and all these people who are trying to get in there. How do you get into the palace? How do you get into the inner room of the palace, Maimonides says? It's through study, it's through intellectual pursuit. And he would have included in there not only Torah, not only just learning the laws and, lighting the candles when you're supposed to and praying 3 times a day. He describes that as those who, if I can find it here, he describes that as those who are wandering around outside the palace but haven't found their way in. So the way to get into the palace is by beginning to study what he calls physics and metaphysics. Physics is science as we know it, the science of how the world works. And metaphysics is the science of philosophy, the science of why the world works. People believed in the Middle Ages, in his time, that you could prove certain things about God and about the universe through logic and through philosophy. And that is the way, as far as he is concerned, that you get in to that you get into the inner chamber. But Maimonides also believes, and this is another preview to 2 weeks from now, he believes that ritual and practice and all of these things really matter. But he believes they matter not so much because God said so. That is, you don't just follow mitzvot because God said so and therefore you do it. They matter because they create in our lives the proper circumstances in which we can grow intellectually. So that if we keep kosher, Maimonides says, if we keep Shabbat, if we follow these rituals, if we are part of a community, if we behave morally within our community, then we create the proper circumstances in which human beings can flourish. And as far as he's concerned, flourish intellectually. So that's really, and we're going to get into much more detail about that 2 weeks from now. But Maimonides ultimately believes that you need a balanced life in order to achieve this, right? That you achieve this through the way you study and the way you practice and the way you eat. He believed very deeply in physical fitness. He writes about that in the Mishnah Torah, that it's important to take care of yourself and eat the right things and all of that, because it builds these circumstances in which you can flourish intellectually so that you can manage to find your way into that inner chamber. Great question. And that's really more the topic for next week's class, when we'll look more at questions of divine providence and questions of practice and ritual. But all of that is built on Maimonides' way of understanding God, because he doesn't understand God to be a person who commands things, right? He doesn't understand understand God to be someone who wants you to do something. He would have called that idolatrous. He would have said, God doesn't want you to keep kosher. That's not the way God operates. God doesn't, demand that you do that for God's own purposes. God doesn't need us to keep kosher. The commandment to keep kosher exists as part of a system of training so that we can build these circumstances, so that we can reach our intellectual capacity, so that we can really flourish. Great question, Dahlia. Thank you for asking that. So, but we're not there yet. That's 2 weeks from now, right? That's all built upon this idea that God is the things that Maimonides is describing God to be here. So I want to go back and read a couple more texts. I'm on page 13 here. Let's read a little more about unity and uniqueness of God. Let's see. David Bernstein, would you mind reading a little bit where it says similarity? All right, David says no, that's no problem. Roberto, would you like to read? I don't know if you heard me. Roberto, would you like to read a little bit here where it says similarity?
Sure, where are you? Which line?
Here at the top, right here, similarity.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, because I'm up north. We just came 2 hours ago, so sometimes the reception is not so good. Similarity is based on a certain relation between two things. If between two things no relation can be found, there can be no similarity between them, and there is no relation between two things that have no similarity to each other. Example, we do not say this heart is similar to that color, or this voice is similar to that sweetness.
This heat, that should have been this heat is similar to that color.
Oh, yeah, right. Remember, I'm Spanish, okay?
You're doing great.
This is self-evident. Since the existence of a relation between God and man, or between him and other beings, has been denied, similarity must likewise be denied. You must know that two things of the same kind, for instance, whose essential properties are the same, and which are distinguished from each other by greatness or smallness, strength and weakness, etc., are necessarily similar, though different in this way. For instance, a grain of mustard and the sphere of the fixed stars are similar as regards the three dimensions. Although the one is exceedingly great, the other exceedingly small, the property of having three dimensions is the same in both.
All right, I'll stop.
Or the heart of wax.
That's
Okay.
fine. I'll stop you there. So two things that share an essence or share that are, let's say, are on a scale with each other can be described using similar words. That mountain is very big and this rock is very small. But they exist essentially in the same existence, right? They're on a scale of large to small. That one's at that end and that one's at that end. But we can't put heat and color on the same scale. We talked about this a little bit before. We can't say, oh, this, this temperature is hotter than that blue. That doesn't make sense. We can't say this, love is stronger than that cauliflower. That's not a sentence that makes sense because those two things are not on the same scale. Similarly, God is not on the same scale as us. So where we might have been tempted to say God is the most wise or the most powerful or the most strong, we can't say that because God is not in this description on the same scale. Therefore, it cannot be said, as they practically believe, I'm reading down here, that God's existence is only more stable, God's life more permanent, God's power greater, God's wisdom more perfect, and God's will more general than ours. And that the same definition applies to both. This is in no way admissible, for the expression more than is used in comparing two things as regards a certain attribute predicated in both of them in exactly the same sense, and consequently implies similarity between God and God's creatures. But because there is no similarity, we cannot use human words to describe God. So where we're going is that we have to describe God in different ways. One more proof, so to speak, that we have to describe God in different ways. Dawn, would you just read this paragraph here for us where it says number 2?
Number 2. To that being, however, which has truly simple, absolute existence, and in which composition is inconceivable, the accident of unity is as inadmissible as the accident of plurality. That is to say, God's unity is not an element superadded, but he is one without possessing the attribute of unity.
I want to stop you for a second, because what Maimonides has just argued is we can't even say that God is one. Because to say, remember, this idea that something is accident, is outside of the essence of the thing. I know this is quite esoteric. If we say there's more than one God, there are two problems with that. One is that we're describing God as plural. The other is that we're describing God as a thing, God as the thing that is plural. But what about oneness? Can God participate in the thing that is oneness in the universe? Well, no. It turns out that even the word one, the one thing that we use to describe God, even the word one, cannot acceptably be used to describe God, which is to say, God is not one. But what can we say about God if we can't even say that God is one? Don, will you just go on and finish the paragraph for us?
When and his brother are
The
wrong.
investigation of this subject, which is almost too subtle for our understanding, must not be based on current expressions employed in describing it, for these are the great source of error. It would be extremely difficult for us to find in any language whatsoever words adequate to this subject, and we can only employ inadequate language. In our endeavor to show that God does not include a plurality, we can only say he is one, although one and many are both terms which serve to distinguish quantity. We therefore make the subject clearer and show to the understanding the way of truth by saying he is one, but does not possess the attribute of unity.
Okay, so Maimonides has in a way backed himself into a corner because he has said the only thing that we can say about God is that God is simple and unified, that God is one. But he's also said that we can't say God is anything, and that includes one. We can't even say that God is one. So what does it mean then when we say that God is one? This sentence is important. In this endeavor to show that God does not include a plurality, We can only say that God is one. In other words, one is our word for describing essentially a way of saying God is not many. But that our word one is actually not adequate to describe what God is, because I can also say, I only have one phone. This is the only phone that I own. But to say that this is the one phone and to say that there is one God are not the same thing, as we've learned earlier. That God's oneness is not the same as the oneness of this pen or the oneness even of me, because I fit into a category of people, a category of brown-haired people, a category of bearded people. But God does not fit into any category. Therefore, our word one is inadequate to describe even the one thing that we can say about God. So what can we say about God? And this is ultimately Maimonides' solution, which I warn you now is going to be an unsatisfying solution to the problem of the fact that we cannot describe God. His solution is that we can only say the things that God is not. So, Errol, would you mind reading for us a bit here where it says no? Nope, Errol says no. Sandy, would you like to read for us?
Sure. Know that the negative attributes of God are the true attributes. They do not include any incorrect notions or any deficiency whatever in reference to God, while positive attributes imply polytheism and are inadequate, as we have already shown. An attribute does not exclusively belong to the one object to which it is related. While qualifying one thing, it can also be employed to qualify other things, and is in that case not peculiar to that one thing. For example, if you see an object from a distance and on inquiring what it is, are told that it is a living being, you have certainly learnt an attribute of the object seen. And although that attribute does not exclusively belong to the object perceived, it expresses that the object is not a plant or a mineral. Again, if a man is in a certain house and you know that something is in the house, but not exactly what, you ask what is in that house, and you are told not a plant nor a mineral. You have thereby obtained some special knowledge of the thing. You have learnt that it is a living being, although you do not yet know what kind of a living being it is.
All right, Sandy, let's stop for a second. Let's unpack this for a moment. What is the difference then between a positive description of a thing and a negative description of a thing? Remember, there's something in the house. I am told, in one scenario, that that what's in the house. Wait, where's the scenario? Right, that there's something in the house. I am told that there is a living being in the house. It turns out it's a man, it's a person in the house, and the information I'm given is it's a living being in the house. That's scenario one. Scenario two is there's a man in the house, and the information I'm given is it's not a mineral and it's not a vegetable. What's the difference between those two scenarios in terms of what I've learned, what I know, and what kind of certainty that I can have? Anybody want to try to unpack that for us for a second?
The former is more helpful to actually know in most situations what the object is.
Yes, it would be more helpful to know that there's a living being in there, as opposed to knowing that there's, whatever's in there is not a vegetable and not a mineral. It sounds like a game of philosophical 20 questions. Is it bigger than a breadbasket? Is it vegetable, mineral? That's one thing. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, but the negative doesn't put you in the conflict of constraining God, because the negative is showing effectively what is not. It's eliminating possibilities, but it's not describing, because when you describe, you are constraining and therefore incurring in some form of blasphemy, probably from Maimonides' perspective.
Okay, right. So from if I'm describing a person, there are things I can say about that person. But remember that in describing God, we have a problem because the things that we say don't actually describe what God is, as we've already learned, that our words don't mean the same thing. They don't adequately describe God. But if I can describe God as not a mineral and not a vegetable, right? That's where we're headed with this. Carla, go ahead.
I was just thinking that it sounds kind of like Sherlock Holmes or
Conrad or whatever his name is, with the or is it Conan Doyle? Yeah, Conan Doyle. When you rule out all the possibilities, so you eliminate by deduction, and therefore you are left with the last remaining possibility, kind of thing.
Mhm.
You rule, like you deduce by ruling out all the other possibilities.
Right. Sherlock Holmes is actually a great example of, that you can learn things by saying what things are not. If it's not this, then it must be that. If it's not this, if it's not that, then it must be the other. And so in a way, what Maimonides is saying, by describing what God is not, we actually are in a way telling us some of the things that God is, but without implying that we know exactly what those things mean. So if I can jump down a little bit, the negative, here it is. This one I meant? Where is it? Oh no, I wanted to start here at this paragraph 2. Carla, actually, would you be willing to read a little bit for us here where it says after? Thank you.
After this introduction, I would observe that, as has already been shown, God's existence is absolute, that it includes no composition, as will be proved, and that we comprehend only the fact that he exists, not his essence. Hence, it is clear that he has no positive attribute whatever. The negative attributes, however, are those which are necessary to direct the mind to the truths which we must believe concerning God. For, on the one hand, they do not imply any plurality, and on the other hand, they convey to man the highest possible knowledge of God, exempli gratia. It has been established by proof that some being must exist besides those things which can be perceived by the senses or apprehended by the mind. When we say of this being that it exists, we mean that its non-existence is impossible. We then perceive that such a being is not, for instance, like the 4 elements, which are inanimate, and we therefore say that it is living, expressing thereby that it is not dead. We call such a being incorporeal, because we notice that it is unlike the heavens, which are living. Whoa, explain that. But material. Seeing that is also different from the intellect, which, though incorporeal and living, owes its existence to some cause. We say it is the first, expressing thereby that its existence is not due to any cause. We further notice that the existence, that is the essence of this being, is not limited to its own existence. Many existences emanate from it, and its influence is not like that of the fire in producing heat, or that of the sun in sending forth light, but consists in constantly giving them stability and order by well-established rule, as we shall show. We say on that account it has power, wisdom, and will. It is not feeble or ignorant or hasty, and does not abandon its creatures. We thus learn that there is no other being like unto God. We say that he is one. There are not more gods than one.
Great.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to go to
Perfect. That's perfect. Thank you, Carla. So,
sorry, can you explain the heavens which are living?
yeah, I'm going to explain it by saying don't worry about it. It's medieval cosmology. They believed that there were living waters in the heavens. It doesn't matter, actually, for our purposes, because that was one of those things that they didn't exactly understand. But I see a couple of hands, so hold on. But before we get to those hands, this part that Carla just read is so important, because what he's essentially saying is, these are all the things we can say about God. We notice things about God in our universe, and they teach us things, and yet we can't exactly use our words to describe it. So for example, he starts here, we then perceive, where is it, what I'm looking for? Right, okay, so Maimonides believes that he's proved the existence of God through various proofs. So we say of this being that it exists, but what we mean by that is that its non-existence is impossible. We don't mean that it exists in the way that we exist. That is to say, we don't mean it's a living, breathing thing that exists in a corporeal way like we exist. When we say God exists, we mean that God's non-existence is impossible. God does not exist. And that's what we mean when we say that God exists. We also, this is your whole thing about the heavens, but we note that God is not inanimate. God is not an inanimate object. That, Maimonides says, we can say with certainty. And so therefore we say God is alive. But we don't mean that God is alive in the way that we're alive. That's not what alive means for God. When we say God is alive, we mean that God is not alive. Therefore, God is alive. But don't think that the word means what it means for human beings. So he goes through all these descriptors and he says, what is God? God exists. God is alive. God has power. God has wisdom. God has will. But what those things really mean is the opposite of their negations. God doesn't not exist. God isn't not alive. God isn't dead. God isn't powerless. God isn't not wise. So these words that we use to describe God, they're not meant to put God on the scale of the things we are. They are meant instead to say the puny things that we can say about God by describing or explaining the things that we know God is not in terms that mean something to our human minds, essentially. So now I see a couple of hands. Norman and Anita had a hand up. Do you guys still? Nope. All right. Ed, go ahead.
Yes, Rabbi. I was just going to say this whole discussion reminds me of the original Star Trek series when the crew used to wind up running into some kind of being that would say, we cannot even describe who we are. Your minds can't absorb who we are and what we are.
Right. And that's in some ways, that's the message of the book of Job also, where in the end, God says to Job, you may not understand what's happening because you don't understand everything that goes on in the world. We exist on different planes. Maimonides actually believes something similar, that we can't actually ultimately ever understand or fathom God's essence. What we can understand, as he said before, is the things that follow after God, the things that exist because God is. And we can therefore describe those things in our own terms. But we need to know, as philosophers, which we all are here, we need to know that our words don't mean the same thing when we apply them to us as they do when we apply them to God. All we understand, and with this, I'll just read this last paragraph, this last sentence. All we understand is the fact that God exists. I started here. All we understand is the fact that God exists, that God is a being to whom none of God's creatures is similar, who has nothing in common with them, who does not include plurality, who is never too feeble to produce other things, and whose relation to the universe is that of a steersman to a boat. And even this is not a real relation, a real simile, but serves only to convey to us the idea that God rules the universe. That is, that God gives it duration and preserves its necessary arrangement. And then he ends with these words, not the end of the guide, but the end of this section. Praise be God. In the contemplation of God's essence, our comprehension and knowledge prove insufficient. In the examination of God's works, how they necessarily result from God's will, our knowledge proves to be ignorance. And in the endeavor to extol God in words, all our efforts in speech are mere weakness and failure. In other words, there's a lot that we don't understand. Maimonides really ends his discussion of God by saying God is a mystery, and God is an awe-inspiring mystery. So we end this discussion by saying, well, there were some things that we could say about God, but largely, God is an awe-inspiring mystery to us, something that we know is there, that we experience, that we can't fathom a world without, as far as he's concerned. But at the same time, that we can't know, and that we can't exactly describe. So I see a couple of hands, and then I'm gonna bridge us to next week. Wayne, go ahead, and then Peter and Joy, or Peter.
So I'm no philosopher, but what I'm taking away from this is that there's a lot of words thrown at us, and I'm narrowing it down to me personally, that God is definitely intangible. And these are all the ways he's saying that you can't compare. This is not what he is, and so forth. And people who believe in God, I think, have had an experience of God, and it's their own experience And if someone says to me, well, describe this experience, the first thing they say is, well, I can't describe it. It's just, it's just something that I can't put it in words. I can't define it. As much as they can try, and they can make various comparisons and analysis and comparisons, but they can't really define their experience.
Yeah, and that is similar to the point that Maimonides is making, is that we don't have the words for this, but we know we experienced it, right? We know that it's there as far as he's concerned, and we don't have to buy into his philosophy. But as far as he's concerned, he says, I know there's something there. I experienced this in the world, and yet experiencing it and describing it are two different things. Peter, go ahead.
In describing him in the negative, in describing God in the negative, and I'm going to use your word, not powerlessness, implies that God is powerful. And if you use all these not thingnesses, whatever the thing is, you end up going right back to Torah, where God is all powerful. God is all the attributes of God that are in the Torah. He says God is not those things. So doesn't he contradict himself?
Well, except that he also, at the same time, he says that the words, that when we use them to describe God, they don't mean the same thing as when we use them. So when he says God is not powerless, what he's trying to avoid saying is God is powerful, because powerful has a meaning in the human world. Powerful, we know what powerful means, and that is, as far as he's concerned, is not the same thing that God is. Because remember, God is not on this scale of, least to most. God doesn't sit on top of the scale of powerfulness. The word power means something different with reference to God than it does with reference to us. And he says at least 3 different times in the guide, essentially, our words just mean something different when we describe God as they do when we describe us. But he says, but we know that God is not powerless, because we know that there are power, that God has an effect, has a power within the universe. But it's harder, but we can't describe that in human terms, because that would limit God. Essentially, the concern here is limiting God. He doesn't want to limit God by putting human words on God, but he does feel comfortable saying God is not this thing. This is not devoid of that thing, essentially. Is it a perfect solution? It's not. And in the end, what Maimonides leaves us with actually is, as I said before, is a sense of mystery. And so it's kind of an ironic truth about Maimonides that he both believes that humans have an incredible intellectual capacity and can understand and learn a lot of things. And in fact, that's the purpose and essence of human life, is to exercise your intellectual capacity, learn and experience and understand things about the universe, but also that there's a lot we can't understand. And that ultimately the essence of God, what God is beyond our capacity to understand. These are the ways that we can describe something that we experience, that we know is there, but that we can't actually describe in our own terms. Which begs the question that we'll answer in 2 weeks, or that we'll explore in 2 weeks, of what about religion? And I know I gave a little bit of a preview of this already, but if this is what God is, and truly, I think, for some of us, God does sound a little bit like this: completely incorporeal, detached from the world, not involved in day-to-day decisions of the world. If that's what God is, then why is there prayer? Why is there religion? Why is there keeping kosher? Does God care about me? Is a question that we might then ask. Does God have a role in deciding whether I get sick or not, or how long I live? Does God care whether I live or die? Does God care about whether I suffer in the world? These are questions that follow from the descriptors, or the description of God that Maimonides has created. It would be one thing if we described God as, a big brother that cares about us, right? Who holds us and hugs us and chooses the best things for us. But we don't actually live in a world where if you pray to God, then God will take care of you. It doesn't always feel that way. People still get sick. People lose loved ones. People die. People suffer. So are we living in a world that's cold, unfeeling, where God doesn't care about us? Or is there some way in which God cares about us, and some way in which our actions can help us to interface with God? And that's what we'll explore a little more when we meet up again in 2 weeks. So for our next session, we're going to read the rest of the packet. We're very likely going to skip over the part about prophecy just because we don't have time to do everything. But go ahead and read the rest. We have prophecy, we have divine providence, and we have mitzvah, that Jewish actions and commandments. And we'll talk about Maimonides' approach to Jewish life based on his understanding of what God is and what God demands of us. So again, thank you to everyone for being here. See you again in 2 weeks from tonight. We'll send out the tonight, and we'll send out the text again, but it's the exact same text. Go ahead and read the rest of the packet, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Thought-provoking.